what I'm going to talk about here is just to show you the differences between how film emulsions capture light versus how CCDs capture light. I had the good fortune, I was president of Dalsa Digital Cinema. It was like having, an intense one-on-one class on how imagers work. So I'm going to illustrate that difference to you because there's amazing technology that's in film, why film has such a remarkable dynamic latitude. And this is just going to give you a glimpse into it. So this is a faux anamorphic image frame, and what we're going to do, we're going to turn it on edge, and we're now looking at the film on edge, and now we're going to zoom in and imagine that we're looking at the film edge on. Okay, now imagine we're looking at the edge of the film. We're not looking straight down on a flat 35mm. We're looking edge on, like with a microscope, imagine, that we've zoomed in on. Amazingly, the film emulsion is remarkably thinner than the actual base that it's laid on. When film is not developed yet, you don't see yellow, cyan, and magenta layers like this. They actually have no color in them yet until they get processed. And what happens is, what is unique about film is there is no filtration that goes on in film. They have layers that are sensitive to the colors of light. The yellow layer is sensitive to blue light, the cyan is sensitive to red light, the magenta is sensitive to green light. They become yellow, cyan, magenta after they get processed because they're the negative colors, the complementary colors to red, green, and blue. And the other thing is, when Kodak makes a negative, it's not just 3 layers, it's actually dozens of layers. And there's at least 3 layers in each of the red, green, and blue primary layers that have high, medium, and low speed layers that are sensitive to light, which is pretty remarkable technology. Again, remember, we're looking edge on here and how this stuff is much, much thinner than a human hair. And they coat this stuff on with incredible precision. And again, I just illustrate here how that it's like a green shaft of light isn't stopped by the yellow sensitive or the blue sensitive and red sensitive layers. It just passes through and isn't captured until it reaches a layer that actually is sensitive to that red light, the cyan actually sensitive to the red light, the yellow actually sensitive to the blue light. And now here's the contrast too. When we talk about film resolution, we've often talked about that it had 4K's worth of resolution. And 4096 resolution, when you talked in film space, you were talking about Air Force resolution charts, which meant 2,048 line pairs of black and white, that if you zoomed in on a Spirit 4K or in a Magic, or name your 4K scanner, a Northlight, you could actually resolve alternating black and white lines, 4,096 of the lines as you zoom in. And when people talk about 4K cameras, they assume that it's just exactly the same thing. It's not at all. So this is my imaginary digital camera. You just wish this is how they resolved and how they actually saw. Because actually what you saw in the previous frame is film, how much of the area of a film frame is sensitive to light? Anybody want to hazard a guess? 100%. That's called, in the digital space, that's called fill factor, the actual area that is actually sensitive to light. So let's go on, next step, we're going with our imaginary sensor. That might be an ideal situation. But notice here, you see the black areas there? Those are the areas that are reserved for laser pointers that don't work. Come on, baby. Anyway, the black areas are insensitive light, and by the way, this sensor does not exist. This is getting a little more reasonable. This is actually a very common fill factor in a lot of digital cameras. So the Genesis camera, by the way, has a fill factor of less than 30%. Just for example, that's one I happen to know because I have all the internal Sony documents on. So I'll speak to the Genesis today. They're getting better. That F65 fill factor is much, much higher. But none of them come close to film because they require all this circuitry transferring. Previous one. So this is my point here. You could technically say you have 4,096 of these pixels across an image. And people will call it 4K. Is it the same 4K as a film 4K? No, it's not. So the point thing I try to get across to people, when I used to work at Technicolor, when I first met John doing dailies on film, when Technicolor or Agfa or Fuji would come out with a new film stock, cinematographers would go, well, exactly what exploding dye couplers are you using in the emulsions? Are you using sodium bromide molecules? No one ever got into technical. They shot pictures, and they went into a screening room and evaluated the images on a screen. Now in the world of digital, everybody thinks digital is simple, and actually, it's complex, just as complex as film, and I promise you, no one in this room, including me, is qualified to evaluate a digital imager. So don't go think of it just by somebody says, it's a 4K camera. Don't do that. Shoot images, shoot tests, and evaluate the images. That's what used to happen with Kodak. They say, we've got a new film stock, I'm dating myself, back in the 80s, and it's a 320 speed, and Owen Roy's going to shoot his test, and he goes, no, maybe it's 200. And yet now when they say a digital camera has a 3,000 effective speed, and people go, wow, it has a 3,000 effective speed. What happened to cinematographers that didn't trust that stuff? Don't trust these people, because they'll tell you this is 4K, and it ain't the same 4K. They're just counting numbers here. They're not talking image quality. Okay, so then this is, again, this would be an example of what's called an interline transfer array. You have columns of red, green, and blue pixels. This is what's called a Bayer pattern. Some people dismiss Bayer patterns. Sony dismissed Bayer patterns as being the work of the devil until the F65 camera came out and has a Bayer pattern, and suddenly Bayer patterns are now good again. So let me be clear to you. You buy the best Nikon, Canon camera, the Hasselblad camera, they all use Bayer patterns. And again, just because you don't understand it because you're not a good enough mathematician, Bayer patterns actually work quite well. They use very complex mathematical algorithms. When I was at DALSA, again, it wasn't the greatest camera in the world, but when it was on its game, it was looking good. We dramatically improved the image quality by improving the math of the Bayer algorithm. The sensor didn't change, it was just the math involved. And when you're getting in digital, it's a lot of complex math. But you also notice here that photons that have, can you hear me? Yeah. Like blue light that lands here, guess what? It doesn't capture it. And another key thing, John was talking about Technicolor. Why are these photos, why does a CCD need red, green, and blue filters? Anybody have any idea? Because CCDs and CMOSs are immune to color. They don't see color. What did the Technicolor camera use? Anybody know? Black and white film. So they use filters. So you'd have a black and white record of the red, a black and white record of the green, a black and white record of the blue. What's going on with a digital camera? It knows that this blue photo site here is only capturing blue light, so it actually is capturing a black and white electronic record, a voltage, of the blue light. It's kind of interesting, kind of full circle here, going back from Technicolor all the way around to CCDs, and you're basically dealing with the same kind of black and white record of converting the image information. This is a mathematically accurate representation of a Genesis camera, for example, which is now kind of déclassé. Cameras are now getting much tighter fill factors, but this is an example. A lot of films have been shot with this camera to show you that, again, you have the red, green, and blue photo sites. The area between the photo sites is used for transferring the information off. It literally, when it captures a picture, it shifts. Let's say it takes one frame out of 24 frames a second. It then shifts the voltage from the red photosites to another set of photosites that are between these photosites, and then transfers them down in a vertical line. There's a little problem, though, with digital cameras. I promise you, anybody ever take their cameras on an airplane? Okay, every time you do that, you kill photosites on your camera. Because when Canon, Nikon, Casio, Panasonic ship cameras in North America, they do it by boat. And that's because you need about, at altitudes of 20,000 feet and higher, you need about 125 feet of concrete to shield yourself from the gamma rays at higher altitude. They don't hurt us, but gamma rays induce voltages in sensors that fry out pixels. So what happened on a film called Superman Returns, for example, Sony shipped all these new Genesis cameras to North America by boat, and then Panavision packed them all up and shipped them by a 12-hour plane flight to Sydney. And unfortunately, they were looking at their images on a display that was 1440 resolution, yet the images were 1920 by 1080. They didn't notice during production that a lot of these rows were dead as a doornail, because when you'd have I hate laser pointers. When you'd have a dead pixel in one of the transfer rows that would transfer the charge off the sensor, it would kill the entire row. It was kind of cool. It mimicked a negative scratch. So every frame would have these black lines. And every camera had a unique signature. So I'm going to get off this, John, real fast here. But just to let you know, there are these things that go on. And this hasn't gone away yet. When I was at DALSA, when I was at Sony, and I first learned it at Sony, complaining about a Canon camcorder I had that had all these blacked out pixels. And Sony said, oh, Hummel-san, did you ever take your camera on an airplane? I said, well, yeah. And they said, oh, well, that's the problem. And at DALSA, when I said, well, we should tell people about this, they said, oh, no, we don't want people to know about this, because there'll be big class action lawsuits about people who have cameras complaining about their losing pixels. Go do a checksum on your Canon camera after you do a plane flight. You will find dead pixels. Sony has software for their cameras that hides out the dead pixels once you get a camera back that's been on a plane flight. All the camera houses use this software. How many people knew this? Interesting. I mean, and by the way, film's gone. It's going to go away. I know, but the film is immune from gamma rays and things like that. So to let you know, there are things along with digital. Everybody thinks digital is just like film, but it's digital. No, it's digital. It's entirely different. There we go. Okay, remember when we were looking at the film edge on like that? Now we're going to do the same thing to the digital sensor. I'm basically taking those photosites. I've now rotated them on edge. And we should see some photons that they come in. You see the white light comes in, and it captures the red elements of the white light, the green elements, the blue elements, and recorded in photosite wells. An interesting thing happens, though, with these photosites. And by the way, these are graphic representations. They're not, they're kind of like this, but the result is the same. When you use a short focal length lens on a digital camera, this happens, where you have the white light that captures the red elements also will skip across and hit green and blue, and you get these artifacts that look like chromatic aberrations. So this, with film, when you have light coming in at oblique angles, it's kind of cool. There's a difference when you have 100 years developing an imaging device versus about 40. You use a short focal length lens or anamorphic with film, the photons land on the surface and get immediately refracted perpendicularly down through the layers like this. So you don't get those kind of chromatic aberrations. You might say it's not a problem, but it's actually been a problem on several films where they had to go in and fix these chromatic aberrations. I can't name this film, Superman Returns, you can see that this is a zoom in here, and you can see the multicolored edges, and that's exactly because of that artifact, because it was shot with a very short focal length lens. Past presentation, just to show you the differences. Again, we're now looking at the edges, and these are called digital ice cream cones, I've decided. These are the red, green, blue lenslets, and underneath them are the wells. What happens when digital cameras, they capture photons? Notice some of the photons are dying a death and not ever captured because they're landing in the air, they're not filled up. What happens is the photons kick off an electrical charge. The electrical charge fills up the bit buckets, and that's transferred off the sensor, and that's how you determine your brightness over, under exposure, because of that electrical charge, depending on the amount in each individual bucket. And yes, you might be surprised, when I was hired at DreamWorks, I was not hired as an animator, so be kind to my animation here. Another artifact that happens, let's say we're shooting a bright neon sign. So a white light with a lot of blue energy is coming into that blue photosite. And what can happen is the blue photosite can overflow and contaminate the adjacent photosites. And also happens is electrons come cross between the wells in the silicon and actually contaminate. That's called fixed pattern noise. And that's why it's so hard to get digital cameras that do high-speed frame rates really well, because they have to dump these wells electronically 24, 30, 48, 60 times a second. And whereas film, it's kind of cool that every individual frame is a new imaging device. I don't know of any digital cameras that have done that yet. That was a joke, John. But when you have to empty those wells really fast, you have remnant electrons still bouncing around, so you shoot higher speeds, you get a little higher noise floor. Now, I know we can shoot really beautiful pictures with digital cameras, but right now, when you're shooting high-speed frame rates, it's hard to get them to approach what you're getting with a Canon 5D or 7D, which spends something like 1/4 of a second rendering one of its frames in high image quality mode.